Good morning. On International Women's Day, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have a conversation with Hannah Rose Thomas, author of Tears of Gold, Portraits of Yazidi, Rohingya, and Nigerian Women. Hannah, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Lou. It's wonderful to be with you.
Let's begin with you sharing about the purpose of the art projects that form the basis of your book. Can you tell us a little bit about this, what's behind it, the stories that led to the publication?
So it all began from the art workshops that I organized first with the Yazidi women, then in the refugee camps with the Rohingya refugees, and then also in northern Nigeria with survivors of Boko Haram and Fulani sexual violence. And I was really aware that so many of the key texts on trauma healing talk about there being two primary foundations, and it's the creating of safe space to enable the sharing of story. And so I was really interested in the idea that the role that art can play to create a safe space for the Yazidi women, for the Nigerian women, for all the women that I've had the privilege of meeting and working with to share their stories. Because research shows that for survivors of human rights violations, everyday verbal language is inadequate to convey the extent of the trauma and the depth of their emotions. So I was wanting to understand how art can help giving a new form of communication to address that silence and the unspeakable pain as well. So I taught the women how to paint their self-portraits as a way to share their stories with the rest of the world. And then when I was in Iraqi Kurdistan, the Yazidi women themselves asked whether I would then paint their portraits. So for my exhibitions, I showed their self-portraits alongside my paintings and their testimonies. So it was a way to enable their voices to be heard in places such as the House of Parliament or Buckingham Palace, Lambeth Palace, UNHQ, and other contexts. So it's looking at the role that art can play in trauma healing, but also in advocacy as well.
And then how long of a process I'm curious, from the time of the completion of those art projects to a book?
Oh, a long time. It's been about 5 years in the making. So for each series of portraits, when I painted the portraits after I returned from the art workshops in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Bangladesh, in northern Nigeria, and I spent about 3 months, I would say, per kind of series of portraits. So they're about 8 portraits each, respectively. And so, yeah, these took a long time. It was a labor of love, and using these early Renaissance painting methods that I use is very time consuming. So I really interested in the idea of the paintings themselves being an extension of that love and that care for the women that I met, using these methods to dignify them, to share their stories. So it's been, yeah, a long journey, but an incredibly enriching and a real privilege.
You know, you mentioned among the groups that you worked with, Yazidi, and many women and people around the world are probably familiar with Nobel Peace Prize laureate and Yazidi survivor, Nadia Murad. And she wrote something at the beginning of your book, and it was that Yazidi survivors are much more than victims. And can you expand on that statement and how that manifests itself in those art projects? In other words, we love to hear people tell their stories, but the victimhood can be a dangerous place to stay.
Yeah.
Psychologically.
Yeah, I think conflict itself leaves so many wounds, but perhaps one of the most significant is the invisible stigma that so many survivors of sexual violence face, and the perceived also association of survivors and their children of wartime rape with the enemy only compounds that sense of shame, pain, isolation, and trauma. And so, I'm really interested in how we can show compassion to all survivors, and not to underestimate the power of listening and bearing witness to another person's story, and to create for the art workshops and the paintings themselves be a form of hospitality to make space for their stories and voices to be respected and valued. And I think in media, in the media accounts of the Yazidi women's stories, for example, we kind of get this narrative of the kind of barbaric accounts of rape and torture and enslavement of the Yazidi women. And it's very othering. It's very difficult for us to be able to connect to, for they are very much presented through this lens of violence and victimhood. But this wasn't the story that the women wanted to share through their paintings. When I met them, the message that they conveyed was the grief for their loved ones lost, their children still in captivity, their husbands that were killed, loved ones who they don't know their whereabouts. And that was the message I kind of wanted to come across most through the paintings. And so I used the symbolism, the images themselves kind of have a parallel towards paintings of the Virgin Mary, because the Virgin Mary herself, her heart was pierced with grief for the loss of her son. So this parallel, in many ways, because these images of the Virgin Mary are so familiar to us in the West, Western viewers, it helps to see these women's stories through that same lens, and for it not to appear so other, for we can begin to comprehend the grief of a mother who's separated from her child. And it's that way in which we can feel empathy and connection to these stories that otherwise are very difficult to understand and feel very distant and difficult to relate to.
You know, you mentioned the portrait of the Mother Mary. Often those are historical, use a lot of gold. And so as a portrait painter, I'm interested in that you chose to use gold leaf in your portraits of these displaced women and the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And what does that represent?
Yeah, so the gold leaf really, it kind of is to create that allusion to images of icons, so sacred art throughout history, like I was speaking about the Virgin Mary. And the use of gold leaf also has real kind of symbolism around, with notions connected to the divine and also the sacred, because it doesn't change or tarnish with age. And so I use these methods not because they're beautiful, but because of that symbolism that they convey. And it's because I want to convey this message that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. And so each and every person is endowed with this intrinsic and inalienable dignity, and imbued with such a worth and a sacredness and fundamental rights that just cannot be eroded. And I find when I'm painting, it's almost like I'm praying that God would open my eyes to see each person as he sees them, and to reverently behold the image of God, or the Imago Dei, in each person, and particularly in places where it's been denied.
And so that's where your title came from, Tears of Gold.
The Tears of Gold, actually, the title came from the women's self-portraits. So both in Nigeria and also in Iraqi Kurdistan, the women wanted to paint their tears for their grief, but they use gold. So which I found, one woman, Aisha from northern Nigeria, she said that symbolized God turning her mourning into dancing and her tears into joy. And I thought that was just beautiful to hear her say that, and really touched my heart. And that was the inspiration, the women's self-portraits.
Wow. I know that also the subtitle is Portraits of Yazidi, Rohingya, and Nigeria, but and towards the end of the book, you speak about some other populations.
So there's a final chapter of portraits of women who've come from Afghanistan. So women I met here in the UK who were judges who fled after the Taliban's takeover of Kabul. There are also Ukrainian refugees who I've met here in the UK as well, or and also in Romania when I went out there for an art workshop. And there's a Uyghur woman who escaped the concentration camps in Xinjiang, and also a young woman from the Gaza Strip. I only met her remotely, virtually via Zoom, so I painted her portrait. Yeah, not without meeting in person, but yeah, it was to kind of shine a light on these other conflicts. Most of these paintings were done during lockdown, so it wasn't really possible to do the art workshops in person, but still a privilege to paint their portraits and to get to know these women and share their stories.
Wow. Throughout history, regimes, the reason I mention other groups, we know that regimes have perpetrated, dehumanizing and violence, and they use it to justify the atrocities and suppress dissent. The afterword in your book was quite interesting. Christopher Bailey, who was the art and health lead for the World Health Organization, he wrote, what makes art transcendent and transfigurative and not manipulative propaganda, even with the best of intentions? And he cited some fascinating reasons for that. And it goes back to the victimhood, and when these women are in such a vulnerable state, using not just the workshops, but their personal portraits, even with their permission, and promoting that. It's that fine line, and which I believe you've walked beautifully, but can you speak to that? I mean, some of the reasons that he brought up, that we understand how to work with, it's their story, it's not ours. And so how does the art not co-opt it, if you will, but work for the good?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I'm very aware that the arts themselves are just they're not inherently healing or liberating, but art can play a role in it creating space for healing to take place, and for creating space for the openness and receptivity and compassion necessary for empathy and understanding, but it can also do the opposite. So it's a very fine line to tread, and it's got to, the women and their stories have got to be at the heart of the work, really. And I think, as a Western woman going into these contexts, you feel altogether aware of your privilege, and aware of that fine line to tread. And so how to make sure that it's a space that honors, that creates a space where it's the women who are first and at the forefront of leading it in many ways, that it's communal, that it's participatory, that it's kind of fueled by questioning and self-reflexivity and kind of desire to go beyond one's limited perspective. But I do believe that the language of art, it can transcend barriers, whether they're geographic or linguistic or cultural or national, and speak to our hearts and foster empathy. So it has a real potential, but also it's been used in really many negative, destructive ways by regimes throughout the centuries as well. So I feel very aware of the impact of propaganda and all these other ways in which art can be used. But I found that in my time with the women, I tried to come in from a place of vulnerability, of sharing some of my own story, of my own journey through trauma, and speaking with the women actually was also part of my own healing journey as well, my time with the women, and their responses and their kindness to me. So I saw it very much of us going on a journey together in many ways. It wasn't just coming in and bringing an art workshop and then, but it's a really difficult one though, because I come back and paint the portraits and then they're shown in these different places, and the women, I don't have contact with all of them. I haven't been able to reach all of them after, particularly the Rohingya still in the camps. They're kind of spread out across the camps. It wasn't possible.
That was going to be a follow-on question. I mean, wondering how those you have been able to contact, their response to see that they're not only their portrait, but part of this bigger, profound body of work. How have they responded to that, those who were aware?
Well, the women I've been able to speak with and to share the work with, they've been really touched, I guess, and feel like their voices have been heard. And I've been able to get copies of the book to one of the Yazidi women, for example, has now been relocated to Canada, and she kind of sent me a message on Instagram, and she just said to me, she wanted to thank me for all my work and what a difference that project 6 years ago, nearly 7 years ago now, had made in her life when she was at her lowest. And that just like, it brought tears to my eyes to hear, to
Mhm.
just receive that after all those years. And I've been able to get copies to Tasne, who's a Uyghur survivor. She was actually at the IRF summit where you and I met, and also to the Afghan judges and the um, the mother and daughter from Ukraine who are based in the UK. They're coming to my book launch on Friday, so I'll be able to give them copies of the book and the prints of their paintings as well. So it's just a real privilege that, and it's just incredibly special whenever I've been able to see them and meet them in person, and after painting the portraits, and I hear those responses, and that's yeah, I just wish everyone could know. I wish I still had contact with every single one of the women, because it's
Well,
the work that's for them. So it's, yeah, and their voices, they are being a voice to other women who across the world who've experienced what they've experienced, and their courage in sharing their story through this way is also encouraging other women to continue to share their story too. So
during this journey, the long journey, for them and for you, what surprised you, if anything, about the project?
I think, yeah, I've been surprised just at how it's resonated with different people, so many different people, and the responses to the work, even in government contexts and other spaces like that, how people have been moved to tears reading the stories. And I remember showing the work in GCHQ, which is kind of government intelligence headquarters in the UK, and people came up to me and said, we're doing work kind of to help these people on the ground, but it all feels very distant. We're working, but and they're not doing work on the ground, they're kind of doing work from here to try to prevent these kind of atrocities from happening. But actually seeing some of the faces and the stories of the women, it just made it much more real. And I think in this modern world, we can get quite inured to suffering with the relentless bombarding we have of news and the media. I think it can become difficult to encounter one another, to hear one another's story, or kind of to engage in these so many conflicts, when it's just overwhelming, really. But when you can hear one person's story and meet them face to face through a portrait, it creates a different space for an encounter. It creates a different space for understanding and empathy. And so I think I've just been surprised at how people have responded, and the warm reception it's received, in particularly kind of political and humanitarian contexts, more than the art world context. But,
Do you have closing thoughts? Where do you go from here? I'm not asking, necessarily what your next project is, but how has this changed you and your work? And do you see other projects in possibly continuing the work with refugees, or in human rights, or women? Or it's a pretty broad question.
yeah, I'd love to be able to continue this work, and but to also like to find a way where like where I can actually be raising funds to go directly back to the women through this work, so for it to be more cyclical somehow, as well as more sustainable too, to find a way to make this work more sustainable to continue doing. I'd love to learn and understand more the healing potential of the arts, as well as the role that the arts can play in advocacy, and continue to document. I mean, there's no end of kind of conflict and stories to document from around the world. My next project is due to be Bosnia, so meeting some of the mothers of Srebrenica, to paint their portraits ahead of the 30th anniversary of the genocide, which is next year, 2025. So that's on the horizon for the next project, as well as potentially painting portraits of survivors of modern day slavery too. So those are two issues that I'm hoping to have the chance to be involved in, like sharing stories of women from these contexts. So yeah, I'm not altogether sure what the future will hold, but I'm continuing this journey with an open heart, and seeing where it will lead, as it's kind of been embarked on and unfolded in unexpected ways. I would never really have anticipated doing this work, a decade ago, using art in these contexts, but it's an incredible privilege. And yeah, I hope to be able to continue it and to see more artists able to use their skills in these contexts and to raise awareness about human rights issues. And yeah, that I would love to see other artists in this space too.
Well, it's a very thoughtful and powerful piece of work, body of work, and I hope you can continue also. You know, we tell the stories in writing and we tell them in using photography, but not as much in art. And so there's certainly a lot of room and opportunity, as you said, to expand. I encourage people, Tears of Gold by Plough Publishing, and good luck with your UK launch this Friday. Hannah Rose Thomas, Tears of Gold.
Thank you.